Okay. Now this is a personal treat for me. Ed Morris and Susanna Sayler. So these guys come to Los Angeles to see Matt Coolidge. Matt Coolidge, by the way, is here. He's in this, he's right back there. Yeah, all right. I think, was that Matt? Where are you? Matt? He's in the building. Okay. He's outside. All right. So these guys come to Los Angeles to talk with Matt Coolidge, and Susanna Sayler is a high-end commercial photographer traveling around the world, and she's been reading these articles by Elizabeth Colbert about global change. Not just temperature change, but ocean acidification, all this, the entire complex that we refer to in the Anthropocene as global change. And she's been photographing the work that scientists do around the world to measure changes that are occurring. Receding glaciers, lakes that are changing their characteristics, all these sorts of things, fires that are burning that would otherwise not be burning. So she's going around the world compiling this photographic body of evidence about global change. And she wants to do a book. And so she and Ed and I sit down to talk about doing a book. So here's Susanna, who's a photographer, fairly straightforward photographer, making a very good living as a commercial photographer. Now Ed's got most of a PhD in Japanese poetry. But he kind of runs away from that, and he ends up being a private investigator with a large firm in New York City, which perfectly qualifies him to do field work, right? So the two of them form this collaborative practice, and it all starts out with this idea of let's do a book of these photographs of climate change. That's a nice, this is years ago, so I mean it's fairly early on in the game. This really nice idea, and the photographs are certainly wonderful, and we have them here in-house. But something happened on the way to the forum. They started a collaborative practice that was much larger than themselves, that involved other artists, that involved other projects to show the effect of global change on the planet. I believe that what they are doing as a model of an open practice and a way of including other people, a way of getting museums to repurpose their collections, I think that's a model of behavior for fieldwork, investigation, and artistic practice. Ed and Susanna, come on up.
What a great introduction. Thanks, Bill. You got to hold off your questions about my being a PI till later. Everyone tends to focus on that. So.
That's right. Well, first of all, big thanks to Bill, David, Sarah for inviting us to this wonderful conference. I'm just sad that we have to wait 3 years for the next one. Can you change that? And about the title, I think that was a placeholder. I just want to show you we're not going to sing. I was actually on a panel once where one of my co-panelists broke into an impromptu operatic aria, which was amazing, but we're not going to do that. We're going to talk about more about time and time frames today.
Yeah, so speaking of that, just before we get into our talk, I want to do a bit of housekeeping. This could be a historic moment here. I want to settle one thing. Is it Anthropocene or Anthropocene? Everyone Anthropocene, raise their hand. Any Anthropocenes in the room? That's like, must be a it's got to be a Britishism. All right, we're going to go with Anthropocene. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so it turns out that if you put a ton of ice on a park bench in New York, people will either ignore it or think it's mildly amusing. Some will have fun by trying to destroy it. This is an excerpt of a 40-minute video loop by John Santos for the Canary Project. We put a 200-pound block of ice on a park bench and had a surveillance cam record what happened. One person we filmed tried to stab the ice repeatedly with an ice pick. In a way, it was the one gesture that seemed admirable and weirdly constructive. We wondered if more of this sort of thing isn't needed in the sustainability movement. The adventure of this piece is a contrast of different concepts of time. Ice time, measured by the pace of melting, New York time, the pace of passing, and personal time. One couple breaks up on the bench behind the ice, another skates on top of it, this dog does its business. And it's difficult to tap into the frequency of another sort of time, such as geologic time, particularly when we are so busy. And we really are very busy, which it turns out is a real problem when it comes to understanding possible ecological catastrophe, such as climate change or mass extinction, that are happening at the intersection of geologic, animal, and human time. Whatever we know about it, say, for example, climate change, we can't actually really believe it. Slavoj Žižek diagnoses this as follows, quote, "Our attitude here is that of a fetishistic split. I know very well that global warming is a threat to entire humanity, but nonetheless, I cannot really believe it. It is enough to see the natural world to which my mind is connected. Green grass and trees, the sighing of the breeze, the rising of the sun. Can one really imagine that all this will be disturbed?" Unquote. The result of this split is that a fundamental disbelief in the potential trauma of climate change is a greater impediment to political action, actually, than ignorance of the science. And when I mean disbelief in climate change, I mean everyone in this room doesn't believe it. I don't believe it right now. It's just not a belief that you can hold for very long.
In 2006, Ed and I founded the Canary Project to produce art, media, outreach, and a word, culture, that deepen public understanding of the Anthropocene. Why culture? Why understanding? Why Anthropocene? And why deepen? Our aims were essentially activist, and our primary concern was climate change. Now, there's obviously no silver bullet to mustering collective will to address climate change as witnessed by our current state of total near inaction. However, we felt that our particular contribution could be to, in an effort to brook Zizek's fetishistic split between simply knowing something and believing it to the extent that one might act. For as Desartaux observed, the strength of a belief is in action. We try a lot of different things at the Canary Project to cultivate this belief, both in ourselves and others. We create direct activist projects, such as poster campaigns that seek to foster feelings of anger, urgency, solidarity, hope, and the feeling that you can make a difference. We organize workshops where we engage a variety of age groups in learning about resiliency and sustainability skills and ideas. We produce mediagenic interventionist or participatory artist projects that capture broad audiences, such as Increase Your Albedo, or production on Eve Mosher's High Water Line project in New York. And we produce contemplative works for museums and galleries, such as this still from a large-scale video installation regarding the extinction of the passenger pigeon, which is currently on view at Mass MoCA. In these projects, we sometimes come up with the ideas ourselves and find partners to execute them. We sometimes support projects that other people bring to us, and we sometimes create we sometimes create our own work under authorship Sayler Morris. As such, our practice is curatorial, creative, activist, administrative, and academic. Since 2006, we've produced more than a dozen projects involving hundreds of artists, scientists, writers, and volunteers.
So in the past, what Frederick Jameson called the incorrigible ambiguity of art rested on the notion of art as autonomous, on an insistence that art and culture are completely separate. Now, obviously, we don't believe that, and I think probably more and more people don't. Probably most people in this room do not. We think of ourselves as cultural producers, and we produce culture in many modes, including something you might term art. And culture, what culture is, what we regard culture as the environment of the mind. Culture is what defines the sphere of action. It is what dictates options for the subject for subjectivity. It is what defines normality, acceptability, what is honorable, what is shameful, what is important, and what is possible. And cultural producers of all types are not merely subservient to cultural forces, they help to shape them. So, for example, the Beatles were not merely slaves of fashion, they helped to make fashion. They opened up possibilities. Or to take a more serious example, gay marriage was an impossible idea about 30 years ago. But artists like Mapplethorpe, Group Material, or Ground Fury contributed to a culture where it became normal. Contributed, not single-handedly made, but contributed. Even, and this is important, if that was not their primary intent.
When we say culture is the environment of the mind, we mean that in the sense of Jacob von Uxel's Umwelt. Umwelt is defined as the perceptual world in which an organism exists and acts. Such a world is radically different from organism to organism. The world consists only of elements that carry significance for the organism, those things which interest it, so to speak. What the organism cannot sense, it cannot react to, or in other words, what the organism cannot sense does not exist for it. Here's that notion explained with reference to a tick. The tick's Umwelt is defined by its sensory perception of three things and three things only: heat, light, and the scent of butyric acid, which its warm-blooded mammal prey emit. It often waits for long periods of time on a blade of grass for the perfect moment to jump off and attach itself to prey like you. The tick's life is governed by its environment, which consists solely of these carriers of significance. If none of these three things is present, the tick will not move. If it does sense any of these things, it will spring into action, its legs will move, and its mouth will clamp onto its prey. In these terms, our environment is precisely what Zizek describes as the natural world to which my mind is connected. Our environment consists of a myriad of smells, colors, sounds, etc., that can trigger some possible action. And our environment is so different from the environment of a tick because what we sense is so different. Each creature's Umwelt is as distinct as a thumbprint.
So the analogy of von Uxel's Umwelt is helpful for the points we want to make here today for two reasons. First, it is illustrative of how completely different and essentially unimaginable are the life worlds of other living creatures. Yet, despite this absolute otherness, von Uxel shows the way to at least putting ourselves in a vantage point to begin to respect the challenges or the color of these worlds. This sheds light on our essential problem of how we begin to imagine the unimaginable, or to brook Zizek's fetishistic split, and move beyond our perceptions of the normal. Second, von Uxel's concept of the natural world can easily be applied to culture, which we are calling the environment of the mind. We react to and are shaped by the signs of our cultural world just as much as the signs of our natural world. But culture is made and can be changed. What we imagine can grow. It is clear enough how the Canary Project's most direct activist or educational projects might seek to influence the network of cultural signs, opening up new or widening existing pathways for the always in flux subject. However, what we want to explore with the remaining time here is how our more contemplative, dense, or even academic projects might strive to do the same, even if these works are available to less people, given how busy we all are. Our claim is that a fundamental disbelief in the trauma of climate change is a greater impediment to political action than ignorance of the science. And that the primary, or perhaps only, opening onto this trauma is to understand, meaning to deepen our feeling for, the epical and cataclysmic intersection of human and geologic timescales. This is the one way that we can step outside of our Umwelt, the overwhelming perception of the normal that is our everyday life. And this requires us to encounter the central paradox of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene requires that we see ourselves both as enormously powerful, as agents of geologic change, and also as enormously fragile, as kind of specks on the geologic continuum. To make this mental maneuver, we must levitate, if only for a moment, above our Umwelt. We must step out of ourselves to see ourselves. For this project, surely art, and its so-called incorrigible ambiguity, its penchant for disorientation, unsettling, nuancing, and questioning, certainly has a valuable role. What follows is a brief explanation of one way that we see our photographic practice contributing to this effort to imagine the Anthropocene.
A History of the Future, the project that Bill mentioned, is an ongoing project that consists of a set of photographic images, all landscapes, taken around the world in places where scientists are observing the impacts of climate change. In starting the project, we wanted to see what could be seen of climate change in a still image, but more importantly, what could be conveyed through these images that might bridge a gap between scientific data and public understanding of the issue, understanding being some combination of knowing and believing. This map shows the locations for the project. The basic idea was to work in varied latitudes, not exclusively in polar regions or equatorial regions where much climate change imagery is generated, but also treating middle latitudes where populations are denser. And we also wanted to look at a variety of impacts, so melting glaciers and ice caps, drought, extreme storms, rising sea levels, and disrupted ecosystems. This image was taken at the first location for the project that we visited 3 months after Hurricane Katrina. Although the image was taken in the aftermath of an extremely catastrophic hurricane, from the beginning there was a certain quietness to the images. The quietness was not something that we had planned on, but only noticed gradually and began to formalize in our editing and shooting. This is from a statement written in 2009, 3 years into the project. We are drawn both to the stillness and the potential for violence in these landscapes. It's important to note that the violence is not necessarily in the landscapes themselves. The meaning of these images depends on their context within a larger discourse about climate change, a discourse with many registers: scientific, journalistic, activist, artistic. In the aggregate, the photographs form an archive and can be positioned as evidence. Viewed individually, the images form a blank stare. How we meet that stare depends on our changing perceptions of nature. Is nature in these landscapes fragile or violent, indifferent or damaged? So it turns out that going to these places was a kind of strange and disorienting process. We would be so immersed in the research and climate science for each location before going, talking with scientists and journalists. And then we often had this experience of getting to the location and simply not seeing what we had been hearing about. And this is because climate change in general happens imperceptibly in geologic time, not in human timeframes. So without an overlay of information, the viewer was often left with this blank stare, as if something was hanging in the air. So we were faced with a choice, either to dramatize the landscape in some way in order to activate feelings of indignation, disgust, wonder, dismay, or to confess a feeling of incomprehension, disorientation, loss of scale, seduction, panic. One is a gesture of mastery, the other one of submission. Wanting to make pictures that reflected our experience of the landscape, that would represent the strange silence that we experienced in these places, we chose the latter. Within the areas demarcated by local experts, usually scientists, we shot whatever made us feel rather than simply comprehend that change was truly beginning, i.e. that the history of Earth is long compared to the short history of humans, that time marches on, that unimaginable forces of nature are constantly changing the land, that seeing the past is seeing the future, etc. In short, we photographed what in the field in real time seemed to manifest not the facts of climate change per se, but its trauma and uncertainties, as absurd and impossible such a project sounds, and in fact is. In other words, we ended up photographing some scenes that were directly photographs of climate change impacts or potential climate change impacts, such as burning trees, melting glaciers, damaged coral reefs, growing deserts. But we also created some images that were not so direct, that treated the topic more obliquely, such as this one of a mountain in Peru that evidences not one but two melted glaciers, one that created the flat valley at the bottom of the mountain, and one that sculpted the side of the mountain. Neither glacier disappeared due to current anthropogenic climate change, and the glaciers came and went in very different times. The image inspired this note, which has expressed a key underlying thought in the project. Most of us barely know how to read the land. Once you start to learn, even a little, you are confronted everywhere with absence. You are drawn back into the past, and it seems, at first, the only direction you can go. You see glaciers in the striations of the stone, the flatness of the valley at the foot of the mountain, the meltwater, the rocks left behind in a field thousands of years ago by the withdrawal of a nearly unimaginable force. Yet, feeling the past in this way is like taking a few hard steps up a hill, gaining elevation from which you can ultimately hope to see in all directions, even the future. Then there's this image from Antarctica, which does not depict a melting glacier or ice cap, but instead is a photograph of the tension between knowledge and belief, science and religion. The image is of a church in the middle of the Russian scientific base. The wooden church was brought plank by plank from Siberia and reassembled here to make it the southernmost Orthodox church. Climate change is a statistically created research object. Its body is all science and knowledge, but it has a soul too and consists of an empathetic response to the enormous potential for loss and suffering. Once we had the photographs, we wanted to put them to work. As with our practice as a whole, we tried many things. We put them on the sides of buses, on billboards, in school presentations, science museums, city halls, magazines. However, we became more and more convinced that the quiet images were best left quiet and not loud. And in some ways, the rest of our practice, posters, workshops, etc., is born out of a recognition of the limitations of photography in general, and our photographs in particular. Lately, we have become more interested in pairing the photographs with archival objects and images in an effort to create a meditation on different time frames.
So why would we do this? Well, a photograph and a fossil have something in common. Both are defined by a body of knowledge, and yet both emit the trace of an existence that cannot be fully absorbed. In looking at a photograph, we are looking at something that absolutely was, but absolutely never will be again. We are looking at both presence, the literal shining forth of a person or object in the world, quality of space, and absence, the disappearance of that thing, quality of time. A photograph at its core does more than point to reality in the manner of a sign. It represents that reality. Whatever else is added by way of a contemporary context, a photograph most essentially says, here now is this that was there then. The same can be said of any fossil, and by extension, any archival object held by a museum. The object is an extraction, something taken out of time. Whatever we know about it, we can never know it completely. It emanates an existence, a presence. Generally, in a museum, we try to pull that presence closer to us with information by knowing more about it or becoming familiar with it in some way. However, paradoxically, the more the object is made subordinate to knowledge, the more its aura recedes. The more general the object becomes within a taxonomy, the less its specificity is allowed to flourish. The authentic relation to us of any archival object or image is this very remoteness. When we draw something close with interpretation and a determination of its exact significance, we lose that essential distance, call it an exoticism, in which we feel our own selves made strange to the interaction. On the other hand, there is an important difference between photographs and archival objects. In normal usage, a photographic image conveys the momentary and intimate. It represents the merest sliver of time, whereas the archival object conveys the epical and abstract. It stands for a whole swath of time as representative of something generalized. So we're currently interested in developing exhibition strategies that combine photographs and archival objects in a way that brings them closer together, that make contemporary photographs stand as if fossils and the make fossils, on the other hand, draw close to us as photographs.
These are some documentation shots from an exhibition we put together some time ago at Indiana University, where our photographs of climate change, quote unquote, were hung with caption text, without caption text, I'm sorry, along with these objects curated from various collections within the university, all disciplines that contribute to our understanding of time frames in some way or another, anthropology, botany, geology, etc. The objects include a 19th century text on African farming, glass slides from an early Antarctic expedition, a lump of coal, a baby elephant skull, a fossil, a botanical drawing. Because of the exhibition's title, Canary Project Works on Climate Change, the viewers knew that climate change was a context, but we wanted to take away all the data and charge that always comes with conversation about climate change, and instead create an intuitive, more intuitive associations and a sense of disorientation. In this exhibition at Harvard, we employed similar strategies, this time drawing on one collection, Harvard's Peabody Collection of Archaeology and Ethnography, and focused more exclusively on the construction of human culture within the time frame of a landscape. We're currently working with these exhibition ideas again, now as Smithsonian Artist Research Fellows, as well as fellows here at the Center for Art and Environment. And we'll have a new exhibition in 2017 at Harvard's Carpenter Center for the Arts and Harvard's Natural History Museum.
So this last image is the front and back cover of a publication that we recently produced to accompany a video installation at Mass MoCA. And on the right, on the left is a close-up of a passenger pigeon specimen that we took. And on the right is an image of an eclipse from the public domain. In the mid-19th century, the passenger pigeon was possibly the most abundant bird in the world. It flew in flocks of up to 1 billion that would literally darken the skies, creating what Audubon called a noonday eclipse. It went extinct very rapidly, and the last one died in captivity on September 1st, 1914, 100 years ago. In the 19th century, nobody believed in species extinction. It seemed so far-fetched. And they certainly did not believe a species as populous as the passenger pigeon could go extinct. All the birds which could be killed by man made the smallest impression on the vast multitude contained in one of these flocks, noted one observer. In the same way that people in the 19th century did not really believe it possible for the passenger pigeon to go extinct, today we don't really believe in climate change, or indeed the possibility of our own extinction. It is just not a belief that we can hold very easily or even for very long. The potential disorientation, even discomfort caused by a non-illustrative, pensive display of images or of objects from an archival collection can be an opening, albeit a very small one, onto a more substantial sense of what it might mean in Zizek's words to disturb the normal world to which our mind is connected, the sighing of the breeze, the green grass and trees, the rising of the sun. This has been stated in this talk as a greater receptivity to a very real potential trauma, somewhat darkly. But it might just as well, in discussing some other project, be referred to in the Harrison's language as re-enchanting the world. Thanks.